Esther's story is about the providence of God, the way that he guides events behind the scenes toward the outcome that he intends. And it proves that even when he's silent, he's never absent. Along with that also, it shows how it gives us opportunity to be part of the outworking of his plan. That the moments he brings us to, we want to try to answer them, to be glad for the chance to be useful. Now, the first half of the book of Esther was about getting her into position to be useful. The rest now is about how she stepped up in her role as the advocate of the Jews. And once again, it gives a picture of what the Lord constantly does, how he provides for the protection of his people and for the punishment of his enemies. Knowing his faithfulness should lead us to be bold in doing and pursuing what's best. And so to see how this worked in Esther's story, we'll turn there again now to chapter 5. And if you didn't bring a Bible, but you're using one of the ones that we provide here under the chairs, that's on page 348. So Esther chapter 5, at verse 1, it says, "It happened on the third day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, across from the king's house, while the king sat on his royal throne in the royal house, facing the entrance of the house. And so it was, when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, that she found favor in his sight, and the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther went near and touched the top of the scepter. And the king said to her, 'What do you wish, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you, up to half the kingdom.' So Esther answered, 'If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet that I have prepared for him.' Then the king said, 'Bring Haman quickly, that he may do as Esther has said.' So the king and Haman went to the banquet that Esther had prepared. And at the banquet of wine, the king said to Esther, 'What is your petition? It shall be granted you. What is your request? Up to half the kingdom, it shall be done.' Then Esther answered and said, 'My petition and request is this: if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, then let the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said.'" Now remember from last week that Esther was afraid to even go to the king in the first place. There was no guarantee that Xerxes would welcome her. And if he didn't extend the scepter, as we do see happened, but if he hadn't, she would have been killed. That was the law. So this was a moment of really high stress for her. Thanks to Mordecai's advice, the prayers of her friends and family, her own recognition of God's providence, bringing her into that position, she had taken the leap of faith. Sort of. It absolutely took courage to stand before the king, but it looks like she lost her nerve when it came to actually asking for his help. Or at least she decided to try to butter him up first, basically. So instead, she asked the king to join her for dinner, along with Haman, possibly thinking that it would be easier to psych herself up if the enemy were in the room. But then she balked again. The king knew she wanted something, outright asking her what it was and promising to deliver, but she couldn't quite get the words out. So maybe having to say it in front of Haman actually made it harder after all. Once again, then, she asked them to join her for a meal the next day. Now, as we look at this, we can maybe be amused by Esther, or maybe even a little frustrated. But more than anything, of course, what we should take away is that persistence is the lesson here. She could have given up, chickened out entirely. Plenty of people do that in life. They end up being forgotten. But as has often been said, bravery is not the absence of fear. It's being afraid and doing what you know is right anyway. Sometimes it takes us a while to steel our nerve to that point. We shouldn't be too disappointed with ourselves for that, as long as we're sticking with it, giving ourselves another chance. Also, we'll sometimes see that the wait is actually useful within God's providence, as it turned out to be here. To Haman, since he was unaware of Esther's ancestry, everything seemed to be coming up roses. The king loves him. Now apparently the queen does too. Esther's 2 dinner invitations, they puffed him up even further, putting him more and more off his guard. And so in that attitude, he actually goes home to his family and tells them in chapter 5 at verse 12, "Besides, Queen Esther invited no one but me to come in with the king to the banquet that she has prepared, and tomorrow I am again invited by her, along with the king. Yet all this avails me nothing so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate." The more pride he experienced, the more fury he also experienced for the one thing that he felt like he couldn't have, which was the destruction of Mordecai. And so he's blinding himself in his rage over this, over being denied, and so winds up proving the words of Proverbs 16:18, that pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. The next day started to put some chinks in the armor early on. It didn't go very well for Haman to begin with. Esther 6 tells actually one of the more humorous stories in the Bible, and also provides more examples of what I'm talking about with providence, how coincidence is used by God. Because over the night, Xerxes happened, not really happened, but it seemed like it just happened that he couldn't sleep. And so he had a servant read court records to him. Obviously very boring, trying to hopefully get him to the point where he could be knocked out. Well, that servant happened to read a record about how Mordecai had revealed an assassination plot a few years previously by that point. I mentioned that in passing last week. And Mordecai had never been rewarded for that. So the king finds this out that night. At the same time, Haman happened to show up for work early that day. He couldn't sleep either. For him, it was because of excitement. He had decided to ask the king for permission to kill Mordecai that day, rather than waiting for the one when the rest of the Jews were going to be destroyed that Haman had asked to do just less than a week previous at this point. He couldn't wait for the almost a year that it was going to be when that was going to happen. But before he can even say anything, the king asked him what should be done for someone that Xerxes wished to honor. And Haman, the arrogant fool that he was, assumed that the person to be honored was himself. So he requested royal regalia, the robes of the king, to be worn, to ride on the king's horse, and to be paraded through the streets, being praised by a herald. Xerxes immediately agreed to all of that. As we, again, have so often seen, he did what his advisors told him to do, and then he told Haman to go out and do all of that for Mordecai, and to be the one holding the bridle and guiding him on this parade and proclaiming the praises of his mortal enemy. It was a humiliating spectacle for him, and it was vindication for Mordecai, which is a reminder to us. We know that we're not supposed to do what is right so that we will be rewarded. Virtue is its own reward. That's not something that's like a verse from the Bible, but it's very common in our culture. Proverb, basically. Again, not a biblical proverb, but it's something that we say. Good is its own reward, virtue is its own reward. That is true, but reward does also come from being virtuous. So even if it takes an unexpectedly long time, we should have faith that God is working things out according to what He wishes to accomplish, but that He will give us good things for following Him, or bad things for not following Him. Again, that's what Haman and Mordecai are examples of in this moment. It's a humorous prelude, and it shows that things were starting to unravel for Haman. But he, of course, only saw it as a hiccup, as people are prone to do. Well, that didn't go right, but I'm sure things will get better. And he went to dinner looking forward to just putting it all behind him. What happens next? Certainly there's not a lot of humor in it at all. And this is what we read at chapter 7, verse 1. So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. And on the second day at the banquet of wine, the king again said to Esther, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. What is your request up to half the kingdom? It shall be done." Then Queen Esther answered and said, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we've been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, to be annihilated. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss." So King Ahasuerus answered and said to Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he who would dare to presume in his heart to do such a thing?" And Haman said, "The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman." And so Haman was terrified before the king and queen. Third time's the charm. Esther finally felt ready to take the biggest step of all, asking for the salvation of her people and accusing Haman to his face. Thing to bear in mind on that, though, really it was accusing the king. Haman was guided by his hate, and he was the engine behind all of this, but let's not forget, Xerxes was involved too. He was led by his indecisiveness. He had agreed to this pogrom without even knowing who it was for or that it included his own wife. And so it left both men completely shocked in this moment. Haman in terror, Xerxes once again in uncertainty. What should he do? He didn't know. So he left to cool off, leading to the last element of Haman's downfall. Verse 7, "The king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stood before Queen Esther, pleading for his life, for he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. When the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, 'Will he also assault the queen while I'm in the house?' And as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Now Harbonah, one of the eunuchs, said to the king, 'Look, the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman.' Then the king said, 'Hang him on it.' So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's wrath subsided." Xerxes' departure had left Haman really in an impossible situation. Understanding why that is does require some historical context. A king's harem was closed off to all other men. They were not permitted to be alone with one of his women if he was gone. So having been left alone, Haman should have excused himself from the room. That would be the normal procedure. But now he's between a rock and a hard place. If he were to get up and leave, it would look like he was fleeing. If he stays, he's disobeying the law. But he decides to stay because he understood at that point only Esther could possibly get the king to show any mercy. But in looking to beg for it, he tripped over himself, fell on her. And when Xerxes returned, it looked like the prime minister was trying to take advantage of his wife. Because that's what this means. The king interpreted it not as violent rage, like he was trying to get revenge on Esther or attacking her for being a Jew. It was sexual assault, was what he thought. Because everything had started to make sense to him. Haman had taken so much power for himself over the years, so much wealth. Now, it rings a bell. He realizes, Xerxes, that the honors that had been asked for just that morning, to be dressed like a king, to ride a king's horse, to be proclaimed and praised, he had asked all of it for himself. Haman looked like a usurper because he had acted like one. And trying to take the queen in the king's own palace was the last straw, leading to the only decision Xerxes actually makes in this book. And he was guided to it pretty much by the hand. He was told where the gallows was, what Haman was thinking of doing, but Xerxes gave the order, having Haman hanged where he had intended to put Mordecai on display. Because this is how God's justice works. The evil that men intend is returned on them. As Psalm 7:15 reminds us, he made a pit and dug it out, and has fallen into the ditch which he made. His trouble shall return upon his own head, and his violent dealings shall come down on his own crown. Exactly as it was. So much for the chief antagonist of the story, but that leaves the matter of the plan that he had set in motion for the Jews. And the resolution of that is what we find in chapter 8 now, starting at verse 3. Now Esther spoke again to the king, fell down at his feet, and implored him with tears to counteract the evil of Haman the Agagite and the schemes which he had devised against the Jews. And the king held out the golden scepter toward Esther. So Esther arose and stood before the king and said, "If it pleases the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and if the thing seems right to the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote to annihilate the Jews who are in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the evil that will come to my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my countrymen?" Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, "Indeed, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he tried to lay his hand on the Jews. You yourselves write a decree concerning the Jews as you please in the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For whatever is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring, no one can revoke." By these letters, the kings permitted the Jews who were in every city to gather together and protect their lives, to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the forces of any people or province that would assault them, both little children and women, and to plunder their possessions. On one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. A copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province and published for all people so that the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. With Haman gone, Esther was able to secure the king's blessing to undo his plan. Although undo isn't exactly the right word. It's kind of a quirk of Persian law that you couldn't just strike them down. Once, like the king says here, once it's been given, it's given. Instead, an empire-wide addendum had to be put along with it, saying that the Jews would have the right to defend themselves, and also making it clear that the king was on their side and would help them in any fighting that occurred. So it would still be a one-sided fight, but the rules had now completely reversed. And that's saying something that we do need to focus on, because many people who read the closing chapters of Esther, they see them as vindictive. They see it as being about revenge, that the Jews were looking for the opportunity to go out and hunt their enemies as they were going to be hunted. And there were battles that occurred. The fighting ended up killing thousands of people. But what those readers miss, and what I did, it's in the text, the Jews were only authorized to defend themselves, which means that their enemies, Haman's allies, still attacked, even after it was clear that they would lose. That was how blinded they were by arrogance and hate. Haman is the exemplar for all of them, but he was by no means the only one who felt that way. And so the day that had been determined for the destruction of the Jews initially became the day of their vindication and of their enemies' defeat. Now, you recall from last week for communion, I talked a little bit about the day that the decision was made in order to go on the assault against the Jews. And on that day, Haman had cast lots in order to pick when it was going to be that they actually would have this battle. The lots were called pur, but they're basically dice. They're 12-sided. And he had thrown those in order to pick the month, and then it was going to be on the 13th day of whatever month they chose, because he threw them on the 13th day of the month of Nisan. That was what I talked about with communion. That meant that it was Passover Eve. It was possible that Haman had actually picked that date on purpose, since he knew that it was supposed to be a celebration for God's deliverance, and so he might have been saying, oh, well, now it's going to be set as the day that you were destroyed. But the day that they actually chose, so that's when he threw the dice, threw the pur, but they wound up landing on 12. So almost an entire year later. He was thrown in the first month, landed on the last month. So a long time to prepare for that, the month of Adar. And so it meant that that day was really when God selected for the ruin of everything that Haman held dear and for the rescuing of his own people. And so it's been by that selection process that this day has been remembered ever since, with the Feast of Purim. was instituted by Queen Esther and Mordecai and named for the lots that had been thrown with wicked intent, but that the Lord in his providence had turned to good, because every outcome is in his hands. But of course, we go through anything like this, there can be a little bit of a discomfort just with the general idea. Because again, there's some revenge that's being talked about. There's an attack on enemies. There's actual warfare, actual fighting that occurs. In fact, a holy war, it could be called. And as Christians, we know that we're not really supposed to do that sort of things ourselves. Jesus taught us in Matthew chapter 5, verse 44, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. So the question could be asked as we read this story, is there anything good for us to actually take from it? Now, obviously, I'm going to say yes because I'm preaching off of it, but for people who would question that, what we should try to see is, first of all, the reason that we've been looking for throughout this entire series. This time period was still all part of God's plan. He was keeping Judah going until the Messiah was to arrive. So the Lord provided for the survival of his people. Ezra and Nehemiah had been about how he did that in the Promised Land itself. Esther gives a wider view. It's showing how he did it across all of Asia. But remember, Judah is in Asia. It's part of the Persian Empire at this time. If Haman's plan had worked, it would have been destroyed, which was the idea. The enemy trying to prevent God's plan, God making the way for Jesus. That is what everything in Scripture, in the Old Testament, is about. So we should value their victory for that reason, but also then for what comes after. When he arrived, Christ taught us not to seek revenge, and he taught us by example, by submitting to death, rather than fighting against it. And along with that, we can tie in what happens in Esther in what we read today, because there is a kind of a reflection of it with the decree that Haman had sent out in order to destroy the Jews, and then how there was that counter decree in order to fix it. Well, God had sent out a decree of judgment against us. The difference being that we deserved it. It wasn't about hatred, it was about justice. That we have sinned against him, and so do deserve to be punished for it. But Jesus became the counter decree. And he didn't undo justice, didn't just take it away, but he satisfied it by receiving its punishment in our place, and then rising from the dead to prove his victory in this fight and offer salvation to all those with faith in him. And it means that there are still two sides, and there is a struggle that is still going on. And we might not be meant to seek justice, but we will still have, or rather vengeance, but we will still have it. It's just that God's plan is no longer in the national stage. That was, again, why the Jews had to do what they did. They needed to survive as a people for Christ to be able to be born according to the plan that God had. But now we're in what you could call the cosmic stage, worldwide, or the last days is what the Bible itself actually refers to, which is that it's a message that's for everyone all the time. And the survival is of the message, not the bloodline. And when we understand it that way, we can say that Christianity is not a pacifistic religion. It's not against all fighting altogether. It merely understands that the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, as 2 Corinthians 10:4 says. And we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. It's Ephesians 6:12. A war is being waged, and we have enemies. Their judgment will come directly from God, not through us. But it will come. And the destruction intended toward us is what our adversaries will experience. Knowing that is cause for confidence in pursuing God's will and working within His providence. So in telling that type of a story, even though the details are different from the way that we would live now, still we can understand that Esther was not merely looking back, it is also looking forward. And we can follow her example and follow the example of the people in this story to keep fighting. Just to do so according to our King's aims and with His resources, which are all about seeing people saved from what is coming. And Esther actually does talk about that too. In chapter 8 at verse 17, it says that many of the people of the land became Jews because fear of the Jews fell upon them. So people saw the writing on the wall and they got on the winning side. Well, we should want the same thing. Understanding that, yes, evangelism is not meant to be motivated purely by fear. But the point is that we do have to show people how things really stand. That believers overcome no matter what, and that success is not the destiny of the enemy, so that they will join us rather than fighting a hopeless battle. Because the truth, as hard as it might be for delicate sensibilities, is that there is destruction at the end for those who attempt to stand against the truth of God. And we shouldn't want that for them. And the only way to stop that is by teaching them to have faith in Jesus Christ. So that's what we're here to tell you if you are not a Christian. We want you to be saved because there is something to be saved from. It's the trouble that you're bringing on yourself, probably without even realizing you've been walking straight into it like Haman did on that second feast day. And you stand accused of crimes against a holy, perfect God. Accused and found guilty. You have not done everything He requires, but you have been offered a way out. Excuse me. You've been offered it by Jesus, who died and rose so you can have life instead of death. So choose. Will you stay on the losing side? Or will you trust in the Lord Jesus for forgiveness from sin and elevation to eternal life? And Christians, our situation isn't identical to that of the Jews of Esther's day, but it's similar enough that we should see the connection. How God knows what He's doing even if we don't see and hear Him. So if we trust Him, we should be brave enough to do the right thing, even if it's hard, even if it takes us more than one try like it did for Esther, even if we don't see the fruit of it immediately like Mordecai. Because evil's not going to win. Christ has already won. And He left nothing to chance. The dice were loaded for His win. So celebrate Him for it, so the people around you can get a picture of where things are going and get to where they need to be before our day of victory that is coming becomes their day of defeat.